You can't just walk in and say you're the auditor, the woman behind the reception desk said, lowering her voice but not her judgment. People lie about credentials all the time, especially, well, you know. That moment, quiet, casual, was the beginning of what would become one of the most documented reversals of power in the modern corporate world. She had walked in with quiet grace, not entitlement. A steel blue tailored suit, briefcase neatly in hand, ID ready. Her name, Dr. Nadira Ellis. Her title, Lead External Compliance Examiner, contracted by the Department of Labor. Her mission, a quiet, routine audit of Strathmore and Levitt's compliance systems. That is, until a front desk manager decided her presence was suspicious. Have you ever been judged based on your appearance before you even spoke a word? Do share with us which industry you work in and which country, because racism has no boundaries. It was just after 9 a.m. when Nadira stepped into the glossy marble lobby of Strathmore and Levitt, a consultancy firm infamous for courting elite clients but less known for treating its employees equitably. Today was supposed to be standard, a drop-in evaluation with a 3-person internal compliance escort and a pre-booked conference room. But the greeting she received could not have been further from standard. At the front desk stood a woman named Kelly, young, confident, and visibly rattled the moment Nadira stated her purpose. The receptionist scanned her from head to toe, lingering on the natural coils of her hair, the dark hue of her skin, the elegance of her posture. It wasn't the outfit. It wasn't the credentials. It was the disbelief that someone who looked like Nadira belonged in their space with any authority. I've never seen someone like her come through the front for executive audit work, Kelly later whispered to a colleague. They usually look different. What she meant by different never had to be said. At that hour, the building's lobby was a temple of silence. Just glass, chrome, and the occasional elevator chime. It made every passive-aggressive pause sound louder, every side-eye more piercing. Nadira waited calmly, despite the pointed hesitation, as Kelly picked up the phone to double-check the appointment. There was no warmth in her smile, only suspicion disguised as protocol. She asked Nadira to wait on a side bench. We just need to verify a few things. But what needed verifying wasn't the appointment. It was her right to belong there at all. She'd been through versions of this before. A mislabeling of role. A suggestion to use the back entrance. A casual request to wait while others, less qualified, but more expected, were fast-tracked. Still, something about this moment felt deeper, colder, calculated. At one point, Kelly picked up the company phone again, muttering. She says she's the lead auditor. Yeah. I know, right? No, I didn't ask for ID. She had it, but you should see this. Across the lobby, a young associate walked by, glanced in Nadira's direction, and paused briefly to smirk. That smirk was not subtle. It was the look of someone who thought they understood power and where it lived. He would later regret not introducing himself. Minutes passed. The marble bench beneath her was cold and hard, unlike the reception couches reserved for visiting clients. She watched as 2 white men in bespoke suits breezed through the entrance, greeted by name, handed lanyards without question, and led upstairs to executive strategy. Her turn, however, had yet to come. Inside her briefcase was every form of authorization imaginable, federal documents, encrypted tablets, identification from the U.S. government's Office of Labor Integrity. But she didn't reach for them again. Not yet. There was a time to reveal power. This was not it. This was the time to observe, to let the truth unfold on its own, uninterrupted and unfiltered. And it did. A mid-level HR representative eventually came downstairs, not to welcome her, but to interrogate. He asked for re-verification of her name, her contact with their legal department, even suggesting perhaps she had the wrong building. She did not. She had the exact right building. What was wrong was their assumption that someone like her couldn't possibly be the authority figure they had been warned about. This wasn't just an appointment gone awry. It was the documentation of what corporate culture still looks like when bias operates unchallenged. In the background, another receptionist commented under her breath. She probably thinks she's going to catch us on something. These government types are all the same. Picky and overpaid. Nadira didn't flinch. By now, a second employee had started watching more carefully. He noticed her calmness, her silence, the expensive watch on her wrist, and the subtle Department of Labor seal on her lanyard. He knew, but he said nothing. A security guard hovered nearby, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Not summoned officially, but present. Just in case. It was the unspoken "what if she becomes a problem" scenario that security teams train for. The problem was, she wasn't doing anything except existing, in their eyes incorrectly. 15 minutes had passed. The receptionist had made 3 phone calls. HR had offered 0 clarity. No one had offered Nadira so much as a glass of water, let alone an apology. They thought she was bluffing. They thought she was a threat. They thought she was no one. They were wrong on all counts. And as the seconds ticked on, their mistake grew louder. Documented by surveillance cameras, logged by internal security systems, recorded in her own quiet notes. Soon, their biggest mistake wouldn't be treating her with disdain. It would be treating her with visibility. Because when Nadira finally revealed who she was, every eye in that lobby would see the truth unfold not as an accident, but as a mirror. What they were about to learn was simple. You can delay dignity, but you cannot deny it. And when you try, someone like Dr. Nadira Ellis will be the one holding the audit pen. There's a particular type of silence that fills corporate hallways when authority is being ignored. It isn't the peaceful silence of focus, or the respectful pause before a meeting begins. It's heavier, more aware. The kind of silence that follows a misstep, but only when the consequences are yet to be recognized. That was the air that settled across the marble lobby of Strathmore and Levitt as Dr. Nadira Ellis waited in a seat meant to feel temporary. Meant to communicate, in subtle architectural language, that her presence was not yet justified. She had been asked to wait for someone from HR to verify. But it was not about verification. It was about delay. A way to stall, to question, to buy time for someone, anyone, to determine how to handle a woman who didn't fit their picture of power. In offices just beyond the glass doors, mid-level managers sipped coffee and exchanged glances. A woman like her, here, unannounced? The assumption was simple. She must be in the wrong place, or she must be exaggerating her title, or worse, she must be bluffing. They didn't consider that she had walked into the building with full legal authority to examine their internal operations. They didn't imagine that she had been briefed by the Department of Labor, equipped with data, clearance, and a mandate to uncover patterns of bias that had quietly plagued the company for years. They didn't guess she was here not to apply, not to be evaluated, but to evaluate them. Upstairs, a junior HR analyst rolled her eyes as she took the call from reception. A woman downstairs was claiming she was the lead auditor. Her tone was indifferent, but her curiosity piqued when she heard the name. It sounded vaguely familiar, though not from any employee list. She tapped her keyboard, pulling up the day's visit schedule. Dr. Ellis' name was there, clearly marked, pre-approved, and highlighted in green. But that didn't matter, not yet. She clicked away, muttering that someone from compliance could handle it instead. Meanwhile, a slow storm was forming. By now, Nadira's presence was being whispered about between departments. Her name had become a question rather than a credential. One employee speculated that she might be from a legal firm attempting to serve a lawsuit. Another assumed she must be from a recruitment agency who had shown up for an entry-level vendor meeting. Someone joked that maybe she was there to replace the receptionist. Inside her, Nadira felt none of it. Not the jokes, not the doubt, not the whispers. She had trained herself long ago to silence noise that didn't come from truth. But the weight and the knowing, those she felt. Every moment she sat without acknowledgement only deepened her purpose. It was no longer a quiet audit. It was now a test, and they were failing it. A middle-aged manager passed through the lobby, his attention caught by the sight of Nadira still waiting. He didn't recognize her, but he recognized the look of someone who didn't seem to fit. He paused, adjusted his tie, and continued toward the elevator. Not a word spoken, not a nod. Just another signal received. We don't know who you are, but we're sure you're not who you say you are. Her calm remained intact, but her observations sharpened. She began noting behaviors, who avoided eye contact, who whispered, who lingered with phones half-drawn. Her years in behavioral analysis in policy reform had trained her to see what others tried to hide. She was here to identify patterns, after all, and the pattern was already clear. Bias, when left unaddressed, stops hiding. It starts performing. Across the lobby, Kelly at the front desk continued her attempts to reach someone more senior, but her tone had shifted. Less urgency now, more annoyance, as if Nadira's presence had become an inconvenience rather than a scheduled necessity. She scrolled her phone as she waited for responses, glancing occasionally at the woman she still hadn't offered water or a proper seat. Somewhere upstairs, a male executive finally responded to a vague ping from reception. He replied that if the woman downstairs really is the auditor, then she should have entered through the executive level. He made no attempt to meet her. He didn't send anyone either. The audit was noted weeks ago, emails sent, meetings scheduled, but it was all being forgotten in real time, in favor of comfort over compliance. It wasn't until a young black intern, her badge clipped to her hip, her eyes wide with recognition, walked through the lobby and paused, that something shifted. She looked at Nadira, then at the receptionist, then at the posture of the room. The intern didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The glance she gave was enough. Said, "I know who she is, and I know you don't." Nadira smiled, the kind of smile one gives when a small truth reveals itself. A few moments later, the phone at the front desk rang. Kelly picked it up quickly, nodding, scribbling a note. A name was dropped. Someone from legal. A tone of surprise followed. And just like that, she straightened her posture and said someone would be down shortly, but the tension hadn't passed. If anything, it had intensified. A few associates were now lingering near the elevator banks. A couple had stepped outside under the pretense of a smoke break, but they remained close to the entrance, curious. Curious about the woman who had arrived quietly, professionally, and yet had managed to draw this much unease without saying more than a few words. The real irony? They still believed they were in control. Nadira had made no accusations, no demands, no confrontations. She had simply waited, and in her stillness, revealed what years of policies and handbooks had failed to fix. By the time someone from HR did finally arrive, smiling wide, apologizing faintly, offering to escort her properly, the damage had already been done. What she had seen, what she had recorded, and what the building itself had echoed back to her, would all be part of her audit. But there would be no early warnings issued. This was no longer a review. It was a case study. And as they led her upstairs with a sudden flurry of courtesy, Nadira followed, briefcase in hand, with the quiet knowledge that what they'd underestimated was not her position, or her authority, or her presence. What they'd underestimated was the system she had come to assess. And the system, as they were about to learn, always keeps receipts. There's something unnerving about watching a crowd pretend not to watch. The glances that linger just a second too long, the conversations that trail off when someone passes, the body language that shifts. Not in hostility, but in quiet judgment. By the time Dr. Nadira Ellis was escorted upstairs, the murmurs had already traveled faster than any email thread. Word had spread like a hush at a funeral. Someone from the government had shown up unannounced. Black woman. No assistant. No briefcase cart. Unaccompanied. Confident. That final word, though rarely spoken aloud, echoed through departments like static electricity. Confident. It wasn't her skin tone alone that set her apart in the pale glass halls of Strathmore and Levitt. It was the way she walked without flinching. The way she moved like she was allowed to be there, without a badge flashing someone's name above hers. That was what unnerved them most. And now she was inside. They hadn't expected the lobby hesitation to follow her, but it did, like a fog dragged in by her heels. The receptionist upstairs offered a tepid smile that dissolved the moment Nadira turned away. Her escort, a junior HR rep who still hadn't made eye contact, fumbled to find the correct floor plan. A delay, a mix-up, a vague suggestion that someone would be with her shortly. But what none of them realized was that someone had already arrived. The building was watching. At first, It was a glance from a young analyst perched near the corner of the break room. He noticed Nadira being led into a glass conference room and whispered to his colleague, who followed his gaze and said nothing, but their silence was agreement. A quiet yes that what they were seeing wasn't normal. Not for this office, not for this building, and not for this company. Then came the curiosity, the subtle trail of observers who passed by the glass doors on their way to the printer, or who suddenly remembered they needed to refill their water bottle for the third time that hour. Some stood a little too long near the hallway corners. Others walked slower than necessary, hoping to catch a glimpse of this unexpected figure whose arrival had disrupted the rhythm of their controlled environment. Still, Nadira said nothing. She sat calmly at the end of the long table, her hands resting on her briefcase, her demeanor unchanged, no phone in hand, no impatience in her breath, just stillness so complete it became unfamiliar. And that stillness pulled eyes like gravity. 2 interns peered in from the adjacent office. One quietly pulled out her phone, not to take pictures, but to check LinkedIn. The name had circulated, Dr. Nadira Ellis, and what they found confirmed their intuition. Harvard Law, former SEC Regulatory Counsel, advisor to 3 federal task forces. Her profile didn't boast. It didn't need to. The quiet authority of her presence had already done the work. And then came the phones. The receptionist downstairs had made calls she shouldn't have, to people she shouldn't have spoken to. Now, texts were pinging across the building. Screens were being passed under desks. Check this out. She's real. She's not here for a pitch. She's the audit. That last message was the match. Within minutes, the building shifted. The tension that once dismissed her now wrapped itself around every corridor like a tightening thread. Those who had laughed softly under their breath were now quiet. Those who had gossiped by the elevator buttons now stood still, their curiosity edged with concern. Nadira hadn't moved. She waited for someone to begin, not because she needed permission, but because their delay was her documentation. Every misstep, every whisper, every awkward pause was data. Cultural evidence, behavioral metrics disguised as inefficiency. From the floor above, a senior associate had stepped out of her office after overhearing a colleague mutter something about a federal probe. She came down pretending to check the coffee pot. She looked in through the glass, caught Nadira's calm gaze, and immediately turned away. Not from rudeness but recognition. She'd seen that face before, not in person but in headlines. During the Bailyn and Myers audit, during the Pinnacle banking hearings. And just like that, she knew this wasn't a pop-in review. It was an exposure. On the lower floors, interns began sharing what they'd heard. Stories from past employees, comments about the promotion pipeline, whispers of disparities that HR had always denied but no one could prove. And now here she was, proof wearing heels and silence, seated in plain view. The conference room was becoming a stage. At one point, the elevator dinged and 3 executives stepped out, mid-laugh, until they saw her. The laughter stopped like someone had flipped a switch. One of them tightened his tie. The other checked his watch. The third simply said, "Is that her?" Yes, that was her. What Nadira understood, what they were only beginning to learn, was that power doesn't always announce itself with sound. Sometimes it enters without an entourage. Sometimes it waits until the silence is loud enough to hear every misstep. And sometimes it lets the crowd build itself, unaware that they're gathering not as spectators but as evidence. There was no formal announcement, no grand entry, no name on the door, but still they came, one by one, quietly, casually, clustering in corners, hovering near windows, pretending to pass by. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was calculation. Who else had interacted with her? Who had seen her waiting in the lobby and done nothing? Who had ignored her presence, dismissed her email, rerouted her calendar invite? The quiet questions now lingered in the air, replacing the easy confidence they wore like lanyards. And Nadira? She watched them all without judgment, without malice. Just awareness. This was what they had invited. This was what they had underestimated. And now this was what they could not ignore. The crowd had formed. But what they didn't realize was that they weren't witnessing a spectacle. They were becoming part of the story. The moment when power shifts doesn't arrive with applause or ceremony. It doesn't announce itself with sirens or speeches. Instead, it lands like a tremor, barely perceptible at first, before it begins to break the foundation beneath those who believed they were untouchable. That tremor began the moment Nadira Ellis opened her briefcase. For over 35 minutes, she had waited without resistance, observed without complaint, and endured what others might have called professional oversight. But to those who had been watching carefully, quietly, the scene had begun to sour. What had once looked like skepticism now revealed itself as sabotage. What they mistook for harmless protocol had metastasized into something more dangerous. Institutional arrogance. Nadira knew this dance. She had seen it before too many times in too many forms. She had seen it behind closed doors at board meetings where men fidgeted in their seats as she read aloud salary discrepancy charts. She had heard it in conference rooms where executives claimed surprise when presented with hiring bias statistics. And now, once again, she was watching the same script unfold. Except this time, the script would be rewritten, and she was the one holding the pen. The audit briefcase clicked open softly. That single sound, a hinge unlocking, turned heads across the floor. Inside, beneath a matte black leather folio and a sealed binder embossed with the Department of Labor insignia, lay a small plastic envelope. She removed it with the precision of a surgeon and placed it on the table, just as a senior compliance officer finally stepped through the door. He arrived breathless, his face drawn tight with apology and confusion. His hand extended as if to shake hers, but she made no move to meet it. Instead, she slid the envelope across the glass table, resting one manicured finger against its edge. What followed was not confrontation, but recalibration. Because as the officer opened the document and read the first few lines, his posture changed. His eyebrows lifted in recognition. He glanced again at her name, her badge, and then back at the line that mattered most. Authorization for an immediate, unannounced investigative audit, approved by the Department of Labor's Office of Compliance and Equity. The air changed, the hierarchy inverted. Up until that moment, Nadira had been treated as a question mark, an anomaly to be vetted. But now, in less than 2 seconds, she had become the answer no one wanted but everyone suddenly feared. This was no routine site visit. This was federal oversight, and it was already underway. Word spread fast. It always does when careers are at risk. Within minutes, the temperature in the building dropped, not in degrees but in demeanor. People moved with new caution, conversations slowed, and those who had ignored her now remembered her name. They began whispering it with the reverence of those realizing they might be mentioned in the footnotes of a report that would decide their futures. Nadira didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The documents did the speaking for her. The audit notice, the staff interview schedule, the list of departments flagged for review, all neatly typed, all ready for execution. She watched the realization ripple through the room. The same HR representatives who had questioned her credentials now scurried to locate files. Legal began calling back extensions that had gone silent just hours before. Middle managers flipped through policy binders they hadn't opened in years. Executives whose offices once felt miles away now asked to drop by for context. The most profound power is the kind you never have to prove. It's the kind others reveal in how they respond to it. And here they were, unraveling in real time. At one point, the head of operations passed by the conference room, doing his best to project composure. He'd heard what was happening and stopped mid-step when he saw Nadira seated calmly in the same position she'd held since arriving. Her presence hadn't changed, but his perception had. He adjusted his cufflinks and disappeared down the hall. It was no longer about who she was. It was about who they had chosen to be in her presence. That was the true audit. Nadira began reviewing the initial compliance logs they provided. A sanitized stack of curated data filled with ratios and percentages designed to impress. She noted the missing pages, the unavailable documents, the discrepancies between what was promised in the handbook and what was practiced in the halls. It was all there, written not in ink, but in the blank spaces where accountability should have lived. People hovered now. Interns who had once whispered leaned in, waiting for some signal that it was safe to approach. Staff members peeked in with guarded curiosity. A few passed her quietly folded notes, anonymous accounts of discrimination, unexplained demotions, silence following harassment reports. The room had transformed into both a war room and a confessional. Nadira accepted each one with the same calm grace she'd carried all day. She made no promises, but those watching knew she didn't need to promise. Her being there was the promise. The receptionist who had first dismissed her came by once more, offering bottled water this time. Peace offering. A gesture made too late. Nadira declined without words. She didn't need hydration. The truth had already begun to flow. By late morning, 2 department heads had requested to be excused from meetings. An internal Slack channel meant for light conversation fell silent. And someone, no one ever says who, disabled the employee suggestion box app entirely. In the background, the intern who had recognized Nadira in the lobby sat quietly at her desk, forwarding documents, compiling screenshots, and sorting testimonies from employees who had stories but no previous outlet. The building no longer belonged to Strathmore and Levitt. It belonged to reality, a reality that had entered without fanfare, without warning, and without any need to shout. Because power, when it is real, doesn't have to ask for a seat. It becomes the table. There is a moment in every institution, every legacy-driven, polished-to-perfection corporate ecosystem, where fiction fractures, where the illusion of order gives way to the truth that was always quietly waiting beneath the surface. This was that moment, and it unfolded not with a shout, but with a name. Her name. By noon, the tension in the building had evolved into something more clinical. Gone were the murmurs of curiosity. Gone were the whispered jokes and uneasy smirks. In their place was a new kind of silence, the type that arrives just before the fall, the kind that swells in courtrooms and press briefings, in HR investigations and deposition rooms, a silence that knows it's about to be pierced by the sound of consequence. They were still trying to recover control, still trying to act like this was salvageable. But control had already slipped, and they hadn't even realized the worst part. It hadn't been taken from them. It had simply been reclaimed. Up until this point, most of them hadn't known who she really was. They knew her title. They knew she had authority. But they didn't understand the gravity of her presence. That misunderstanding had protected them, had allowed them to continue mistaking grace for weakness. But the blindfold was beginning to slip. It started with the receptionist who had first dismissed her. The same one who once scoffed at her credentials was now scrolling through her phone in quiet horror, lips moving as she reread a headline she hadn't connected until now. Federal auditor shuts down banking giant over hiring discrimination. Same name, same face, same woman now seated in their conference room, reviewing their org chart. The realization rippled, room by room. A junior analyst tapped her manager's shoulder, phone in hand, screen aglow with a TED Talk watched nearly 6 million times. The speaker, poised and brilliant, had delivered a speech on systemic workplace bias that had been circulated in DEI workshops across the country. That woman, the one quoted in Harvard Business Review and invited to speak before Congress, wasn't a stranger. She was here, in their building, in their chair, in power. And suddenly everything made sense. The calm, the posture, the quiet refusal to be hurried, the silence that wasn't deference but discipline, the notebook that hadn't moved, the gaze that hadn't flinched, the voice that hadn't needed volume. It wasn't passivity, it was strategy. And now they were watching the consequence of mistaking presence for permission. The executive suite reacted first, panicked but still pretending not to be. Emails were fired off with subject lines like urgent, meeting request, and visibility concern, and audit liaison support. The compliance team went silent. Legal opened a thread titled simply Ellis. She was no longer a question. She was the answer they feared. A few floors down, someone pulled up her 72-page case report on a Fortune 100 healthcare firm that had once claimed they had no identifiable bias in promotion patterns. That report, delivered by Dr. Nadira Ellis, had resulted in the resignation of 7 executives, a multimillion-dollar lawsuit settlement, and a rewritten federal policy on internal whistleblower protections. She wasn't just auditing them. She was preparing to correct them. And that's when the second shift happened, not within the executive team, but among the staff. The intern who had first recognized her was now coordinating with junior analysts who were quietly submitting documents, testimonies, screenshots, payroll discrepancies. No one had told them to, but they understood. This was the moment when truth had power, and they weren't going to let it pass unspoken. An email with the subject line "Anonymous Submission" landed in Nadira's inbox every 15 minutes. By the third hour, there were 17 HR violations, retaliation complaints, pattern analysis data. Every line was a breadcrumb leading to systems no one had dared map before. And as these reports flooded in, Nadira remained unmoved. Not cold, not indifferent, but centered. She had learned long ago that righteous anger feels good, but it doesn't survive in courtrooms. What survived was evidence, precision, composure. So she sat, calmly cataloging every submission, flagging names she had heard whispered for weeks in complaints filed and then conveniently buried. The crowd that had once watched her with amusement now watched with caution. Some with admiration, a few with fear. The ones who had something to hide watched most closely. And then came the final moment. It didn't happen during a meeting. It didn't require a raised voice or an official announcement. It happened when Nadira opened the portfolio she had carried into the building. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a copy of the original Memorandum of Understanding between Strathmore and Levitt and the Office of Federal Accountability, a memorandum signed by the company's own CEO 6 months ago, agreeing to an external audit after whistleblower allegations were made by 2 former employees. Those allegations had mysteriously cleared internal review, but they hadn't been forgotten, and the person tasked with leading that audit had been given full access, full legal authority, and full discretion to deliver her findings publicly if obstruction occurred. It was all there, in writing, on letterhead, and they hadn't even bothered to read it. The document made its way to the department heads. It made its way to legal. It made its way to the COO, whose assistant paused when she saw the seal. And when it made its way to the CEO's inbox, well past lunchtime and far too late, the power shift was complete. Because now they knew. She hadn't come to request access. She hadn't come to ask for cooperation. She had come with permission already granted. By 2 p.m., a senior HR director submitted a request to schedule a realignment meeting. Several directors pulled their names from public-facing projects. Someone in payroll called out sick for the rest of the week. And in the break room, 2 employees, who had once whispered about how overqualified she seemed, now debated whether or not to submit their own stories before it was too late. Outside the building, the sky had darkened slightly. The forecast had predicted rain, but no one had expected a storm like this. She wasn't just auditing policies. She was auditing people, and the results had already begun to surface. What they had laughed at that morning had now turned into a reckoning. Not loud, not vengeful, just absolute. By 5 p.m., the building no longer felt like itself. The polished glass surfaces no longer gleamed with corporate certainty. The muted tones of the lobby no longer whispered comfort. Strathmore and Levitt had become something else entirely. Not a consulting firm, not an employer, not a success story. They had become a case study. A cautionary tale in real time. And seated at the center of it all, unchanged in posture but unmistakable in presence, was Dr. Nadira Ellis. Her audit was no longer theoretical. It had become an excavation. Throughout the day, what began as passive resistance had turned into frantic compliance. Executives who had once refused to acknowledge her arrival now offered meeting slots that didn't exist on their calendars. HR scheduled impromptu clarification sessions, trying to preemptively soften blows they could no longer stop. Even the CEO's office sent word, first an apology, then a request for a briefing, and finally a message that sounded a lot like begging. We're prepared to cooperate fully. But Nadira was no longer taking requests. Her task had become simple, clinical, even. Truth, after all, isn't complicated. It's just buried. Buried in forgotten inboxes and hidden documents, in exit interviews never filed, in training sessions quietly skipped, and in the hush money settlements disguised as conflict resolutions. She wasn't looking for what they wanted her to find. She was documenting what they had tried to hide. By now, her temporary conference room had transformed into a command center. Screens glowed with spreadsheets, interview notes, legal disclaimers, and whistleblower reports. Every file was backed up, every recording encrypted, every data point timestamped. Her intern ally, once invisible in the organization, had become her right hand. No longer just forwarding information, she now managed an intake system for employee testimonies. At least 6 staff members had offered statements under pseudonyms. One cried quietly in the hallway after submitting hers. The building didn't feel like a workplace anymore. It felt like the final day of a trial. There was no alarm, no security breach, no red lights flashing across the walls. But the fear was everywhere, and it was justified. The first formal action came just after 3:30 p.m., when Nadira submitted her preliminary findings to the Department of Labor's secured network. The report was short, only 8 pages, but it was surgical. It named names. It cited timestamps. It included a summary of retaliatory practices against junior staff and women of color. And it recommended immediate suspension of 4 individuals pending investigation. She didn't send warnings. She sent consequences. In one office, the head of people operations was quietly escorted to the parking garage by internal security. No press release, no statements, just absence. His desk would be cleared by morning. Shortly after, 2 directors in compliance were placed on administrative leave. The language was cold, effective immediately, without prejudice, pending outcome of formal inquiry. They didn't pack their things. They didn't say goodbye. They just vanished from the system, their access revoked by IT before they even reached the elevator. By 4:15, the board was notified. The tone of their emergency meeting was different from any prior quarterly call. It wasn't financial strategy. It wasn't growth planning. It was damage control. And even from several floors below, the tension of that call reverberated through the walls like a low hum of panic. Nadira wasn't invited to speak. She didn't need to be. Her report was on their screens, and her silence carried more weight than any statement they could release. The most powerful form of justice is the kind that doesn't need to declare itself. It simply moves quietly, methodically, and reshapes the terrain. Outside the glass walls of her borrowed office, the staff had begun treating the floor like sacred ground. Conversations were whispered. Laughter disappeared. The intern who once carried herself like she might be fired at any moment now walked through the halls with the gravity of someone who had just learned what power really looks like, and how easily it can be mistaken for a threat when it arrives in unfamiliar packaging. By the time the sun began to lower behind the skyline, the firm's executive assistant group chat lit up with stunned messages. A memo had been distributed. Subject: Federal Oversight Personnel Action Update. It included the names of 5 employees under formal investigation. 2 had already been let go. The memo closed with a line that sounded almost surreal to those reading it. All further communication with the lead federal auditor will be facilitated through designated compliance officers. No unauthorized contact is permitted. Dr. Nadira Ellis now outranked the entire chain of command. But she didn't wield that power with cruelty. She wielded it with precision. At one point in the late afternoon, someone tried to soften the room. A senior analyst arrived with an apology and a tray of pastries, a literal offering of regret. Nadira accepted the gesture but not the distraction. She thanked him, made a note in her file, and returned to the screen where wage data painted a damning portrait. Same roles, same performance, same hours, but pay gaps that widened predictably across race and gender. This was no longer about the disrespect in the lobby. That moment had simply been the symptom. This was about a system that had, over time, grown comfortable with its own dysfunction. A system that congratulated itself for performative diversity while quietly punishing those who spoke too loudly, questioned too directly, or advanced too quickly. And now the reckoning had arrived, in heels with a badge and a voice that needed no volume. Nadira wrapped up the day with a closing summary to Federal Counsel. Her tone, as always, was professional. But her final sentence carried a quiet thunder. Systemic disregard for federal employment standards observed. Full recommendation for external governance oversight to be submitted by end of business Friday. By 6 p.m., the lights in the building dimmed to their automatic settings. The office had emptied like a room caught holding its breath. The remaining staff, the ones who stayed behind, didn't do so out of duty. They stayed because they were watching something rare, something they may never see again in their careers. Not a punishment, not a collapse, but a correction. As Nadira gathered her notes and powered down her terminal, she looked out through the glass walls at a company unraveling and rebuilding in the same breath. This wasn't the end. It was the start of something they had never expected. A future built not on perception, but proof. Not on assumption, but accountability. And not on fear, but fact. Change did not arrive with fireworks. Came with silence and signatures. The following weeks at Strathmore and Levitt unfolded not in sweeping headlines, but in restructured calendars, rewritten policies, and suddenly vacant office chairs. The building itself seemed to know something had shifted. The energy that once clung to surface-level prestige, the performative smiles, the scripted equity memos, had dissolved. What remained was something rawer, more fragile. The truth of who they had been when no one was watching. Only now everyone was. After Nadira Ellis submitted her final report, the Department of Labor moved quickly. Oversight was installed. External governance officers were assigned. And within days, the board issued a formal statement, brief, unsentimental, and entirely devoid of spin. They acknowledged a pattern of systemic failures. It was not the language they preferred. It was the language they had earned. For many inside the company, the weeks that followed felt like a slow awakening from a dream they hadn't realized was a nightmare. Managers who once delegated without thought now sat through hours of compliance training led by professionals who looked nothing like the C-suite. Performance reviews now included anonymous peer audits. Every bonus discussion required transparency in compensation benchmarks across departments, segmented by gender, race, and tenure. No more quiet erasures. No more whispers behind closed doors. And most importantly, no more treating discrimination as a PR issue. It was a structural one. And now, structurally, it was being dismantled. At the center of this reconstruction, her name still lingered like a watermark on every document. Not printed, not declared, just understood. Nadira Ellis had not only revealed the cracks in the company's foundation, she had redesigned the blueprint itself. Even those who once scoffed now quietly admitted they hadn't seen it coming. That a woman with no entourage, no volume, no anger, just composure and credentials, could leave behind such an undeniable mark. But those who had watched closely knew better. Nadira hadn't just walked in with authority. She had walked in with memory. The memory of every time she had been told to wait in the lobby. The memory of colleagues celebrated for less and punished for more. The memory of being mistaken for support staff. Of being called aggressive for being direct. Of being held to standards that others only needed to promise, not meet. She carried those memories into the audit not for vengeance but for accuracy. Because when you're documenting systems, you don't just record data. You record patterns. And Nadira had become an expert in patterns long before she ever wore a government badge. Strathmore and Levitt didn't just reform because they were afraid of lawsuits. They reformed because fear had finally given way to reality. They had been caught building a culture on shortcuts. And the cost had finally arrived. Employees, those who stayed, began to walk differently. Not in fear, but in freedom. The intern who once watched from the lobby, now promoted, full-time, handpicked by Nadira's office to join a national task force on workplace equity. A senior analyst who once stayed silent about gendered pay disparities, now leading a salary transparency initiative across departments. Even the receptionist, once the face of doubt, had begun her own retraining. Not because she was forced to, but because she finally understood that implicit bias wasn't just a social issue. It was a professional liability. Leadership, as it turned out, could no longer be measured in how many people followed. It had to be measured in how many systems adapted when the truth showed up at the door. And truth had a name now. By the end of the quarter, Strathmore and Levitt had rebuilt most of its executive structure. They had instituted a whistleblower system routed directly to third-party investigators. Every employee, new and old, was required to undergo a 20-hour immersive equity certification. Diversity metrics were no longer buried in appendices. They were on the first page of quarterly reports. And board meetings now opened with one question: what have we learned from the audit? The answer varied, but it always came back to the same truth. They had underestimated who power could look like, and they had overestimated the safety of silence. As for Nadira, she didn't linger. She never intended to. She closed her audit with a brief statement: professional, restrained, unshakable. She didn't gloat. She didn't burn bridges. She didn't seek applause. She simply documented the final signatures, handed over her encrypted files, and left. But she didn't walk away unnoticed. The intern walked her to the elevator, holding the door like a page at the end of a ceremony. And as the doors closed, Nadira gave her a small nod, not of farewell, but of confirmation. What she had planted here would grow, because truth, once unearthed, is impossible to bury again. The elevator descended. Outside, the city moved on. People walked. Cars passed. Coffee shops opened and closed. But in one building, inside one company, something permanent had changed. Not just in policy, but in people. And that, Nadira knew, was the only audit that really mattered. These stories matter, because they remind us that the greatest power doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it simply walks into a room, waits for the noise to stop, and tells the truth. If the story moved you, helped you see your own workplace differently, or reminded you that quiet power is still power, hit that subscribe button to support stories that create real conversation. Your voice matters, because when we speak up, others stop whispering and start listening. And maybe, just maybe, the next audit won't be needed, because the change already began.